everyone, my name is Ellie, and in today's video we are going to be talking about my Water Blue New World Hanamaru bodice, which I recently finished for Kumoricon 2019. This is part 2 of a build log, so if you haven't seen part 1 when we talked about making the tutu, you're going to want to watch that before watching part 2 because we can't make the bodice without having made the tutu. So make sure you click up there and check out episode 1 before you continue on to this episode. All right, now, if you have watched episode 1 and are ready to watch part 2 where we talk about the bodice, let's get started. Let's do this thing. Alrighty, here we go. Like most of my bodice build logs, I started by draping a pattern. It was really important to me that I drape this pattern on top of the tutu. This way, at the waistline, we can flare the bodice out so it's not going to scrunch up our tutu, it's going to lay nicely on top of it. Now, I'm going to be completely honest. I had to make this bodice at least 2 times. It might have been 3, I might have blocked one out of my memory because the fit just wasn't right. So when you're draping, make sure that you use something that is like your finished product. I should not have been using a basic satin that I had laying around. It might have been cut weird on the bias or all these things. I should have been using a canvas since that's what I was going to be using as a structure of my bodice. So learn from my mistakes and use a like fabric when you're draping. So this pattern that we draped, it's a basic princess seam bodice with the princess seams going out at the arm's eye. However, we have added one extra panel along the bust line. This is something that I saw not only in other tutus, but also in the live version of the Water Blue New World outfits. And while I wasn't being accurate to the live version in most of my costume, I still wanted to pay a little bit of tribute to the costume and use that extra seam. Plus, it's very slimming, seeing all of those seam lines and they're all pointing inwards. It makes you look really tiny, which is fun. It's a fun thing every once in a while. After I had finished draping the bodice, I went ahead and draped the peplum skirt. This, like any other skirt that I've ever made, is based around a circle skirt. This gives it enough volume to sit properly on top of the tutu, gives you a nice waist and a lot of fabric to play with for those fun little pleats at the front of our peplum. So, after I was happy with my draped patterns, it was time to move on to cutting our materials. I started by working on the peplum first. This was because I knew the bodice was going to be pretty challenging and throw me through a few loops, and I just wanted a calm, relaxing evening of sewing. So, we started with the peplum. First, I cut the peplum out of a nice white satin. This is our base layer. I cut 2 copies of this, one for the outside and one for the lining. After that, I cut 1 copy of our sequined mesh material. This material is so pretty and so much fun to work with as well. I thought it would fray everywhere and you would lose sequins all the time, but it's actually really sturdy and it adds so much sparkle and character to your costume. And then lastly, I'm going to be cutting out our blue satin binding that goes around the hem of this peplum. You might notice that I am not cutting this out as bias strips. I wanted this to be one continuous piece, so I cut it out as if it were a piece of this skirt. I followed the edge of my pattern, cutting about 2 to 3 inches of the edge of my pattern out of this blue material. Now that everything is cut out, it's time for a lot of pinning and basting. First things first, I am going to pin and baste my sequin material onto 1 layer of my satin. Once this has been basted into place, we can do the same thing with our blue trim. I'm going to pin this very carefully all the way around the outside of my peplum, and then I'm going to baste it into place, first basting on the inner edge, and then again on the outer edge, just so everything is nice and flat. This is a very important step. Even though it seems like it's just extra thread and extra time, this is going to keep everything in place as we add details and line this peplum. Once all of our pieces are basted together, we can go ahead and add our trim. For this costume, I decided to use velvet ribbon. It just felt right for all my other materials, and I thought it would look really clean. So I went ahead and stitched on my velvet ribbon right on top of the basting for the blue part to the white part. This is going to cover up that seam so we don't get any fraying edges. I'm going to make sure to stitch both sides of the ribbon as closely as possible to the edges. This way it looks very, very clean. With our fashion layer completed, it's time to line our peplum. So I'm going to lay out the fashion layer and then put our second satin layer on top of it. I'm going to pin all the way around the edges, and then I am going to go around with a ruler and mark out my seam allowance. Since I had stitched on that ribbon, I'm going to be using that as a guide to how wide I want this trim to be, so that way everything is perfectly even. So with my ruler, I'm marking out, I think it was 2.5 inches from the bottom stitch line of my ribbon. And I'm going to mark this around with a pin around the entire skirt and then stitch exactly on that. Once it's been stitched, you can go ahead, trim any excess, clip your curves, flip it inside out, and give it a nice ironing. I love the way this piece came out. This might be my favorite part of this costume, just because I think the textures are really fun, the colors are awesome, and it looks so, so, so clean. I love it. It's time to begin on the bodice. Now, I already have my pattern ready, but like I said, this took me 2 attempts and a few failed techniques threw in this. So I'm going to be telling you my mistakes, but I'll mostly be describing what I found worked properly when I made this bodice. I went ahead and cut out all of my materials, starting with my fashion fabric, which is a beautiful blue velvet. This was one of the first things that I knew I had to have when I decided to make Water Blue New World, was a velvet bodice. It's something that this costume just looks so soft and delicate, and adding a little bit of velvet just gave it that extra softness. Plus, I found some pictures of actual ballet costumes that backed up my idea that you could have a velvet ballet bodice. Now, here's one of my first mistakes. This was stretch velvet. It was the only velvet I could find in the proper color, but since it was stretch, it made it a bit more difficult to not only cut, but then it made it more difficult to flatline, which that's our next step. I cut out 2 layers of duck canvas of all my pattern pieces, and then I flatlined both of those layers onto my blue velvet. My machine did not like this. It did not like it at all. It was stretching the velvet all over the place, and I couldn't use the feed dogs because then it would stretch. So I had to just like rip my fabric through. I had to put it down, press my pedal, and just kind of and hope that it worked. Thankfully it did. But I suggest not using stretch velvet if you intend to make a structured bodice. It will give you a bit of pain and struggle, as I found. Now, there was a point making this bodice when I thought that I would add steel bones to all of the pieces. I had even cut them out and put them into my duck canvas layers. But then I realized that if I were an actual dancer, I wouldn't be able to dance in a bodice that was full of steel bones. So I took out most of the bones and only left 1 in center front and 1 in center back as well. So now that my pieces were basted together, it's time to start stitching them together. I'm just using a regular straight stitch and stitching all of my pieces together. This was where I noticed my first mistake with the pattern. It was too small, like way too small. Luckily I had enough seam allowance that I could take that one out and attempt to fix it, but the fit still wasn't right. So this is when I scrapped that bodice and began a new one. Once everything was stitched together and I liked the way the bodice fit, it was time to add some details. Now let's note that the front panel, which is this turquoise panel in the front that makes this cute little V with the lacing, that is not attached yet, and neither is the white chiffon panel that goes in the back of the bodice. I was keeping these separate as I detailed our velvet bodice, just so I had a little bit more maneuverability. The first detail we're adding is some custom-made blue satin piping. Now, piping is often used on ballet bodices, so that way it is easier to finish these edges. Most ballet bodices aren't lined because you're going to need to adjust them for every single dancer that you fit them to, and you want them to last a really long time. So you're not going to really be putting a lining into them. But you have to finish those edges somehow, and you're not going to have just a regular hem along the top of a bodice. It would look really weird. So a lot of ballet bodices have piping along almost all of their seams. But I decided to simply add mine around the velvet parts. So I have piping that goes all the way from center back. It goes up and over the shoulders and then down into the centerpiece. When I originally put the piping on, I put it around the waist as well, but I learned that that kind of affects the fit and how the bodice is going to close. So I added that a lot later. Right now, the piping just goes from center back, over the shoulders, and then to center front. Once our piping is in place, we're able to add our velvet ribbon. This is the same ribbon that I used on the peplum, just so that way it ties the whole costume together. I've used my presser guide. I used my presser foot as a guide, lining it up with the edge of my piping and stitched on my velvet ribbon in the same pattern that I stitched on my piping. So it goes from center back all the way over to center front. Now it's time to talk about the center front panel. This panel looks really, really cool, and it's mostly thanks to the fabric that I found. This is an incredible holographic vinyl / canvas. It was so good. Such a cool find, you guys. It feels almost like leather, or pleather does, but it has beautiful sheen to it, and it's so easy to sew. I found it on an Etsy store, and I will try to put a link in the description below if I remember, because it is such an incredible material. It's really what made this costume, was having this sparkly center panel. Once I sewed together the pieces of the center panel, I went ahead and added our velvet ribbon as lacing. This is just stitched on along the edges of the panel, not in the centers. This way so they can move if they need to, but it is stitched on along the edges. After that, I added a chiffon ruffle to the top of this piece. When I was first working on this, I was just going to make this ruffle chiffon. However, after I had sewn it together on my first mess up bodice, I then realized that this ruffle just kept going bleep, bleep, bleep. It didn't stay up. It looked so bad. So I took apart the ruffle and then I added some leftover tutu netting on the inside. Since the tutu netting is so stiff, it helps the chiffon stay up and in place, but it doesn't add any sort of opacity. It's still opaque, so you can still see through it. It has the effect of chiffon while just having a bit more body. Now that that panel is ready, we can go ahead and attach it to our bodice. This is kind of a weird way to attach something. It is attached just like you normally would, with right sides together. But since you have that piping along the edge of your velvet bodice, you have to be very careful not to stitch over the piping or on the other side of it. You want to stitch as closely to the piping as possible. So that way when you open this up, all you have is this beautiful piping going right along that line. This can be kind of a tricky technique, especially when you're working with bulky fabrics. Considering I had 7 layers of fabric I was sewing together, it was hard to tell where the piping was. But with a few adjustments, you can get it really close so it looks beautiful. Once that center panel was sewn into place, I went ahead and turned everything right side out and stitched in the ditch along the piping, keeping the seam allowance going out. So as I stitch in the ditch, I'm also stitching on top of that seam allowance, so that everything is going to stay nice and tidy and perfectly in place. You're not going to get seams that are trying to flop either way or things like that. Now let's talk about the back panel. The back panel is made with chiffon, satin, and a couple layers of duck canvas. First, I gathered a square of chiffon until I was happy with the gather and ironed it flat. After that, I went ahead and basted it to my satin layer. Now I can add that to my duck canvas and line it with a piece of satin. This is something that I again learned from tutu blogs. Normally it's used for that center front piece, but I thought it looked great on the back too. Being able to only make the chiffon ruffled saves you so much bulk rather than making the satin and everything ruffled. Plus, you can add it on top of your duck canvas, so that way it looks ruffly and soft, but it's actually structured and secure for your dancer. Next, I'm going to prepare the sleeves. The sleeves are one of my favorite parts of this bodice. I think they're super cute and surprisingly easy to dance in. The sleeves are made of 2 layers of chiffon. So I cut a basic puff sleeve pattern, which looks really big, but trust me, you want all that extra material, out of my chiffon. I cut this 4 times. Once it was cut out, I went ahead and stitched together all of the sleeves just along the straight edge. Now I'm going to pair my sleeves up, pin around the bottom edge, and stitch that together. We're basically lining these sleeves so we have a clean edge at the hem. Once the hem is in place, I'm going to add my elastic channels. I added elastic to to these sleeves so that way they were adjustable and really easy to move around in. If I had just top stitched over that gather, I'm sure at one point during my dance, I would have flexed my muscles, which not that I have many, but would have gone, and I would have hulked out of this. So the elastic keeps it secure, really, really cute as well. After measuring very carefully, I'm adding a straight stitch about 1.5 inches above the hem of our sleeve, going all the way around the sleeve. After that, I'm going to move my needle up 1/4 inch or however wide your elastic is, and stitch around again, leaving about 1 inch open. That inch is where we're going to feed in our elastic. So I have put a safety pin at the end of my elastic and I'm feeding it through this channel. Once I have reached the other side of the channel and I have both ends of the elastic in my hand, I'm going to stitch them together and then I'm going to finish off that channel. This makes a completely enclosed elastic. It's a really great trick and it looks so clean. Once our elastics are in place, we can go ahead and gather the top of our sleeves and attach these to our bodice. With our sleeves on, I am now ready to add piping to the hem of my bodice. Again, I am going to go from the center back and then down to the front point and then back to the other side of center back. Now, I decided to do this after constructing all of my bodice, so that way I knew that there were no more adjustments that need to be made and I could easily put it on. It is kind of challenging to put piping on top of other piping, so when you get to that center front point where the two other pieces of piping are meeting, it can be kind of challenging to get over those, but it looks really clean in the end. So now with the peplum, I'm going to go ahead and pin this all the way along the hem of my bodice. I started at center back, and then I'm pinning all the way to the front. Once I reach the front, I can go ahead and adjust those pleats however I see necessary to try to keep them as clean as possible and to make them symmetrical. Now these are just very basic pleats that are put in here to give a little bit of ruffle and fluffle to the peplum. Now, rather than attaching this like I did the center front panel when the piping was between our two right sides of fabric, I'm actually just going to stitch in the ditch along the piping to attach this. It was a lot simpler, and since I want that seam allowance to go into the lining anyway, it doesn't really matter. Now that our bodice is mostly constructed, it's time to begin adding our lining. I cut my lining out of a very basic blue satin, and I constructed it at the same time as I constructed the rest of my bodice. This way I knew that all my seam allowances and any little nuances that I might have made were exactly the same on both my fashion layer and my lining layer. So I am going ahead and matching up all of my seams of my lining with my fashion layer, and I'm going to blind stitch around the entire top part of the bodice. So I am blind stitching my lining as close as possible to the piping because it looks really clean that way, all the way from center back over the shoulders to the center front. Next, we're going to go ahead and finish up the lining, starting by blind stitching the hem. And then we got to finish off the sleeves as well. Rather than blind stitching around the sleeves, which can be a pain in the butt because of all the curves and it can just be really challenging, I decided I was going to finish those with bias. You can finish any sort of seam with bias and it'll very nicely close it off. So I just stitched our bias binding around one side, flipped it over, and blind stitched it. This is a pretty cool method for finishing seams, and if you guys are interested, let me know in the comments and I can do a whole tutorial on how to finish seams with bias binding. So now that our lining is completely attached to our bodice, it is time to add some closures. I went ahead and closed this off with hooks and bars. I used hooks and bars because they're adjustable, and that's how an actual dance bodice would have been made. Plus, the other idea behind it is that if you are dancing and you pop one of your hooks and bars so it comes off or it splits, it's not going to affect all the other hooks and bars. Whereas if you were dancing and you pop a zipper, the entire zipper is gone and that costume is going to fall off of you if you continue dancing. So it's really easy to replace if there were any costume malfunctions. Now, one thing to note about hooks and bars, I cannot put this bodice on by myself. It is actually impossible because I can't reach back there. So that's something to be aware of. I actually had to go to the costume repair room after I had used the restroom at the convention because I could not get my costume back on. So I'm like running there with a couple hooks done. I'm like, help me out, and then they help me click. But anyway, hooks and bars are challenging to do on your own, so be aware of that and make sure that you have someone with you to help you put this costume on. And then the last detail we have to add are the buttons that go on the inside of the bodice. These buttons are the other side to the elastics that we added onto the tutu in the last episode. Like I had mentioned before, these elastics and buttons make it so your bodice and your tutu move together even though they're not actually attached. Really, really cool method, and honestly, you don't even notice that the buttons are there. I had thought originally that you might feel, a lump in the costume or something, but you really don't. So it's an extraordinarily clean method, and it looks really, really nice, and it keeps everything in place, which is incredible. And now you have a complete bodice. While this bodice personally gave me a lot of trouble, there's actually not too many complicated methods going into it. I just chose some kind of complicated materials to work with and made it harder on myself than I probably should have. Oops, it happens sometimes. It really does. So even though I was upset that I had to trash my first bodice, I'm glad I started over and made one that I'm really, really happy with. Let me know what your favorite technique in this video was. Personally, I really like the look of the elastic poof sleeves. I think they're super cute and they're really, really comfortable. So let me know in the comments below what you think of this bodice, if it's something you would like to wear or maybe dance in. And next time, we are going to be focusing on the tearaway skirt that I made for this costume. Yes, it's a tearaway skirt. How cool is that? So if you all enjoyed this video, be sure to let me know by leaving a comment or a thumbs up. And if you really, really liked it, make sure to subscribe and press the bell button so you know when the next part comes out. And until next time, everyone, make sure to keep sewing, stay positive, and have fun. I'll see you all later. Okay, bye. Bye. Bye.